The heat in the Valley of Elah is suffocating. It bakes the cracked earth and turns the air heavy inside the tents of the Israelite army. The problem is that it fundamentally misunderstands the ancient world. We read the biblical text and see a terrifying mismatch in favor of the giant: spears and shields for close-quarters combat. Light artillery stood at a distance and launched projectiles using bows or slings. Goliath was the ultimate heavy infantryman. He was a human tank, engineered to hold a line and crush anything that stepped within his immediate radius. But his immense size came with a severe tactical limitation. He was slow, weighed down by well over 100 pounds of bronze. He was built for stationary defense and close-quarters brutality. He even required a second man, a shield bearer, simply to walk ahead of him and protect his massive, lumbering frame. David, by contrast, stepped onto the battlefield, equipped as light artillery. He was highly mobile, completely unencumbered by heavy armor, and capable of striking from a devastating distance. Ancient slingers were feared across the military world. The biblical book of Judges records a specialized unit of 700 Benjaminite soldiers who could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. Later military historians, such as the Roman writer Vegetius, I've noted that slingers were often more dangerous to heavily armored troops than archers. While a lightweight arrow could shatter against a bronze breastplate, a dense stone traveling at high velocity would cause fatal blunt force trauma, crushing a skull beneath a helmet without ever needing to pierce the metal. Physics dictated the terrifying lethality of the weapon. We assume David survived only by a desperate, miraculous intervention that defied the laws of physics. But ancient military historians read the exact same text. A slinger would place a heavy stone in the pouch, swing it in a wide arc to build centrifugal force, and release one cord at the precise millisecond. A skilled ancient slinger could launch a smooth stone, roughly the weight of a billiard ball, at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. The stopping power of the projectile was roughly equivalent to the bullet of a modern handgun. This is the hidden contradiction that completely reshapes the battle. Goliath is expecting a sword fight. He expects the Israelite champion to walk within the lethal radius of his heavy spear. But David has absolutely no intention of fighting Goliath on Goliath's terms. In open space, a slow, heavy infantryman cannot catch a highly mobile artillery sniper. As long as David stays out of reach, Goliath's massive physical advantages are rendered entirely useless. David is not the underdog. Tactically, he holds the absolute advantage. The valley floor is open. The unencumbered shepherd is holding a weapon capable of ending the fight before the giant can take a single swing. But a tactical advantage is useless without the right supply. A sling without ammunition is nothing more than 2 pieces of leather string before he walks up the opposite slope to meet the bronze giant. David makes a detour and see a completely different mismatch. They do not see a helpless underdog. They see a highly mobile, lethal artillery unit stepping into an open field. He walks away from the terrified army, down into the dry riverbed, to make his final preparation. The Wadi, a seasonal riverbed, cuts directly through the lowest point of the Elah Valley. During the rainy season, rushing water carves through the landscape, but under the baking sun of the standoff, it is entirely dry. David crouches in the dust. He reaches down into the channel and carefully selects 5 smooth stones. For centuries, readers have asked why a young man with absolute theological confidence needed more than 1 stone. A popular tradition suggests that he picked up 5 stones because Goliath had 4 brothers. Another assumes that his faith was slightly fractured, and he wanted backups in case God did not deliver on the first try. But ancient military context offers a much sharper, more practical explanation. David is stepping into an active combat zone against the most heavily armored infantrymen in the Philistine army. He is preparing for a sustained artillery engagement. If the first stone misses, or if it shatters harmlessly against the thick bronze helmet, Goliath will charge. David knows he may need to fire multiple rounds while retreating backward to maintain his tactical distance. Gathering 5 stones is not a demonstration of doubt. It is the perfect marriage of absolute covenant confidence and lethal practical preparation. Faith in God's promise does not mean ignoring the physical reality of the battle. Faith does, against a slow, heavily weighted infantryman. David was not bringing a toy to a sword fight. In ancient combat terms, he was bringing a sniper rifle, not leave its ammunition behind. But there is a profound contrast hidden in the dirt of the riverbed. Look closely at the weapons in this valley. Goliath is covered in bronze and iron. His armor is the product of empire, forged in intense heat, manufactured by human hands, and designed to project visible, terrifying power. It is the pinnacle of human achievement and control. David's weapons, however, were not forged in a fire. The stones in the wadi were shaped over decades, perhaps centuries, by the quiet, invisible flow of water. Long before David was even born, the river was smoothing the edges of the exact stones he would need for this exact moment. This physical reality mirrors David's own life. While Saul and his older brothers were highly visible in the military camps, David was hidden in the lonely pastures. While no one was watching, God was shaping him, teaching him to strike the lion and the bear, teaching him to trust the covenant when he was entirely alone in the dark. The smooth stones were prepared in the hidden depths of the water, just as David was prepared in the hidden silence of the fields. God does not need the manufactured armor of the world. He prefers to use what has been quietly shaped in the hidden places. David drops the stones into his shepherd's pouch. He walks up the bank and steps onto the open field. When Goliath finally gets a clear look at the Israelite, to a knife fight. The real question of Elah is not how a weak boy managed to pull off a desperate miracle. Champion. He is deeply offended. He looks down at the teenager and sees the simple tunic. But more importantly, he sees the wooden staff in David's hand. The giant roars across the valley. Am I a dog, that you come to me with sticks? The Philistine's pride has blinded him. He sees the shepherd's staff and assumes David is coming to beat him like an animal. He is so insulted by the visual disrespect that he completely misses the actual threat. He does not even notice the small piece of leather dangling from David's other hand. Goliath curses the boy by his gods and demands that David step within his reach. He lowers his guard, entirely unaware that the terms of engagement have already changed. The giant is shouting, but the shepherd is already reaching into his pouch. The trajectory is set. The giant is still shouting his curses when the shepherd begins to run. David does not wait for the heavy infantryman to lumber forward. He seizes the initiative, sprinting rapidly toward the battle line to close the distance and establish his optimal firing range. As he runs, his hand drops into the leather pouch at his waist. He pulls out a single, water-polished stone. He seats it into the woven pocket of the sling. He swings the cords in a violent arc above his head. The deeper question is why King Saul, an experienced military commander, and his entire veteran army cowered in the dust, completely paralyzed by fear, building the centrifugal force that will turn the smooth rock into a lethal projectile. The sharp crack of the leather snaps, like a whip across the dry air. At the precise millisecond of the arc, David releases one of the cords. The stone leaves the pouch at a velocity exceeding 100 miles per hour. It is entirely silent, a blur of motion, cutting through the heat of the valley. It crosses the open distance between them faster than Goliath can lift a weapon, completely bypassing the massive bronze shield held by the terrified armor-bearer. The projectile strikes the giant with devastating blunt force trauma, directly on the forehead, the single vulnerable inch of exposed flesh just beneath the rim of his heavy helmet. The text says the stone sinks deep into his skull. The physics of the impact instantly shut down his central nervous system. But notice how the giant falls. With all that forward momentum and heavily weighted armor, he does not stagger backward. The biblical writer records a highly specific theological detail. Goliath falls face down into the dirt. This is not merely a description of gravity. It is an image of divine subjugation. Years earlier, The Philistines had captured the Ark of the Covenant. Why did they look at the valley and see certain death, while a teenage shepherd looked at the exact same valley and saw an inevitable victory and placed it in the temple of their god, Dagon? The next morning, the idol of Dagon was found fallen face down, on the ground, before the presence of Yahweh. Now, the Philistine champion suffers the exact same humiliation. He collapses face down in the dust before the covenant representative of the living God. It is an involuntary posture of forced worship. A cloud of dry dirt rises around the massive fortress of bronze as it strikes the earth. For a brief second, a stunning silence falls over the entire valley. But the confrontation is not completely finished. David runs the remaining distance and stands over the unmoving body. Because he refused Saul's armor, David walked into the valley without a sword. But he does not need one. He reaches down and grips the heavy hilt of Goliath's own weapon. He draws the massive iron blade from its sheath and uses it to sever the giant's head. This is the ultimate narrative reversal. The very instrument the enemy brought into the valley to intimidate and enslave God's people is the exact instrument God uses to finalize the enemy's destruction. The visible symbol of Philistine pride becomes the undeniable proof of their defeat. Later in Israel's history, this same sword. This is not simply a story about bravery in the face of insurmountable odds. It is a story about what happens when years of hidden preparation, it would be kept wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod at the tabernacle, a permanent, physical reminder that the weapons of the enemy will eventually be turned against them. On the northern ridge, the spell of intimidation breaks. The paralyzed Israelite army finally wakes up. Their fear shatters, replaced by a deafening shout as thousands of men surge forward into the valley, chasing the terrified Philistine forces all the way back to their fortified city gates. This historical victory changed the nation and secured David's place as the anointed king in waiting. But it also established a profound theological pattern that echoes across the rest of Scripture. It proved that one man could fight on behalf of an entire nation. Centuries later, another champion would step into a much darker valley. What happened in the Valley of Elah was not merely a military skirmish. It was a highly specific form of ancient combat known as representative warfare. The terms Goliath offered were brutal but simple. The outcome of the one becomes the outcome of the many. If the champion loses, the nation is enslaved. If the champion wins, the nation is free. Notice exactly what the Israelite army did to win the battle that day. They did absolutely nothing. They cowered in the dirt, meet absolute, unshakable confidence in the covenant of God. The smooth stone that will soon cut through the hot air was not a desperate, panicked gamble. They doubted the covenant. They watched in fear. And yet, the moment David severed the giant's head, his victory was instantly credited to them. They stood up and shared in the spoils of a battle they were entirely too terrified to fight. This is where the story expands beyond ancient history and becomes the blueprint for the entire biblical narrative. Modern readers have been conditioned to read this passage as a motivational metaphor. We are constantly told to be like David. We are instructed to find our 5 stones, face our fears, and conquer the giants in our lives, whether that giant is a difficult boss, a financial crisis, or a personnel habit. But that completely misreads the architecture of the text. You are not David in this story. You are the terrified Israelite army, hiding on the ridge, paralyzed by an enemy you cannot defeat. You cannot fight the ultimate giants of sin, death, and judgment on your own. If you try to face them relying on your own strength, or by putting on the armor of your own good works, you will be crushed. David is a historical shadow pointing to a much greater reality. He is a type of Christ. Centuries after the dust settled in Elah, another anointed king would step down into a much darker valley. It was a precise, calculated response from a mind that was not infected by the panic of the crowd. But the terror gripping the Israelite army, Jesus of Nazareth did not face a fortress of bronze. He faced the ultimate, suffocating weight of human sin and the cosmic power of death. Like David, Jesus stepped onto the battlefield as the sole representative of a paralyzed people. He did not arrive with a royal army or earthly weapons. He came in apparent weakness, stripped of worldly armor, armed only with absolute, unshakable confidence in the covenant promises of his Father. The enemy looked at the cross and saw a fragile, bleeding man. The powers of darkness saw what appeared to be total defeat, just as the Philistines saw a helpless boy with a stick. But just as Goliath miscalculated the lethal reality of the shepherd's sling, the enemy completely miscalculated the cross. Jesus used the very weapon of the enemy, death itself, to destroy the power of death forever. He descended into the dust of the grave, effectively turning the enemy's ultimate weapon against him. He rose to secure an eternal victory that could never be overturned. And because of the ancient rules of representative warfare, his victory is instantly and permanently credited to everyone who belongs to his covenant. As believers, we do not fight to achieve our salvation. We do not try to earn our freedom by throwing enough stones at our sin. We stand up and shout in victory. On the northern ridge, thousands of soldiers sit paralyzed in the dirt. The sun reflects off their polished, unmoving weapons. They are not fighting. They are hiding. Was not irrational. The fear was based on visible, overwhelming evidence. The men on the ridge were calculating the odds using the only metrics they understood, because our champion has already won the field. The heavy lifting has been done. The theological victory is complete. The ultimate giant has been severed from his power. But the image of the stones still remains in the biblical text, holding a quiet lesson for us today. While Christ has won the eternal war, we still face daily battles. We still stand on the edges of our own valleys. What does this mean for the circumstances you are currently facing? You are likely standing on the edge of a valley right now. The heat is suffocating. The threat echoing across the ravine is loud, relentless, and demands your full attention. It might be a sudden medical diagnosis, the slow collapse of a relationship, a quiet but suffocating daily anxiety, or a financial crisis that seems mathematically impossible to survive. It looks invincible, and every single day, it demands that you step out and fight it on its own terms. When that intimidation rises, the immediate temptation is to run to the royal tent and put on Saul's armor. The world tells you that the only way to survive a giant is to become one. You are pressured to use the heavy, exhausting tools, height, weight, and metal. Before we can understand the true lethality of the shepherd's weapon and the theological reality he carried into the valley of modern warfare, frantic control, endless hustle, manipulation, aggression, or a desperate need to project visible strength. But you have probably already realized the truth. Saul's armor is too heavy. It does not fit. Trying to fight your fear using the world's metrics of success will only leave you paralyzed in the dust. This is the central contrast of the valley. This was never a story about a small boy overcoming a giant obstacle by discovering his own self-confidence. It is a story about how the unbreakable covenant of God exposes the illusion of human intimidation. The threat you are facing may be physically real, but if it stands in opposition to the promises of God, it is a dead thing walking. True confidence is not looking in the mirror and believing you are strong enough to slay the giants in your life. True confidence is looking at the covenant and resting in the fact that your champion has already won the field. The heavy lifting is finished. You do not have to manufacture a miraculous victory. You simply have to walk forward in the freedom of the victory that has already been credited to your name. But as you walk forward, look at what you are carrying. We must first confront the physical reality of the threat. To understand why David was never actually the underdog, we first have to measure the giant. God does not need you to forge heavy bronze to prove your worth. He uses what he has already shaped in the hidden places of your life. The years you spent in the quiet pastures, feeling forgotten or overlooked. The long seasons of waiting. The unseen, desperate prayers. The daily faithfulness in the dark. These are the smooth stones. They were not manufactured in the fires of worldly ambition. They were formed quietly beneath the surface, shaped by the slow, Steady flow of living water over time. What the world dismisses as weak and insignificant is the exact instrument God will use to dismantle the pride of the enemy. You can drop the heavy armor. You can stop trying to carry the weight of a battle you were never designed to fight on your own. The Valley of Elah is quiet now. The suffocating heat has faded. The massive, overlapping bronze scales that once paralyzed an entire army are buried somewhere deep in the dirt, entirely forgotten by history. The shouting has stopped. The illusion of worldly power has collapsed, face down in the dust, but the smooth stones remain. If this journey into the text helped you see Scripture more clearly, consider subscribing and leaving a comment below about the valley you are walking through right now. You do not need to swing a sword if you can defeat your enemy's mind before they ever draw one. Share this study with someone who is exhausted from wearing heavy armor, and remind them that the giant has already fallen. This was the strategic purpose of Goliath of Gath. When the biblical text describes the Philistine champion, it does not merely mention his height, 6 cubits and a span, well over 8 feet, though some ancient manuscripts suggest slightly less. The exact measurement matters less than the overwhelming physical mass of the man. The writer pauses the narrative to give us a detailed, almost suffocating inventory of his equipment. He wore a bronze helmet and a coat of mail woven from overlapping bronze scales, weighing 5,000 shekels, roughly 125 pounds. He wore bronze armor on his legs and carried a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. The wooden shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, thick and heavily reinforced, and its iron head alone weighed 15 pounds. Even more terrifying, he did not walk alone. The geography of the valley forms a natural amphitheater, meaning every sound carries across the ravine with terrifying clarity. A shield-bearer walked out in front of him, carrying a massive shield designed to protect the giant's entire body from incoming arrows. Goliath was not just a large man. He was a mobile fortress of bronze and iron. Every piece of his equipment was engineered for heavy infantry combat and psychological domination. The sunlight, reflecting off his overlapping scales, would have made him look like a massive, impenetrable serpent rising from the valley floor. His daily ritual was a calculated performance of intimidation. For 40 days, he stepped out to challenge the ranks of Israel, demanding one man to come down and fight him hand to hand. If the rules of engagement are determined by close quarters, heavy infantry combat, Goliath is unbeatable. And this is exactly why the Israelite army is paralyzed. King Saul was chosen, in part, because he was physically taller than anyone else in the nation. He was supposed to be their giant. He was the one man who should have walked down into the valley. But Saul is evaluating the threat, using purely human metrics. He looks at the mass, the bronze, and the iron, and he runs the military calculus in his head. The numbers do not add up to survival. The men on the ridge are trapped because they have accepted Goliath's terms of reality. When you agree to fight your fears on the world's terms, using the world's measurements of success, power, and security, you will always find yourself outmatched. And every morning and every evening for 40 days, the dry silence is broken by the echo of a single, booming voice. The bronze will always be too heavy. The enemy will always look invincible. The Israelites are not just physically intimidated, they are suffering from theological amnesia. They have forgotten who they are. And more importantly, whose they are. Into this climate of suffocating dread walks a teenager carrying roasted grain and bread for his older brothers. When David arrives at the camp, he hears the booming voice of the champion echoing off the rocks. Saul and his generals evaluated the threat using human metrics. But David was reading a completely different set of data. He looks into the valley, but he does not ask about the weight of the spear or the thickness of the bronze. He asks about a promise. The bread is still in his hands when he hears the voice. David stands at the edge of the camp, the smell of fear, and unwashed bodies all around him. He listens as the Philistine shouts his daily blasphemy across the ravine. All around him, veteran soldiers recoil. Men who have survived brutal combat shrink back into the dust. But David's reaction is entirely different. He does not ask about the giant's height. He does not ask about the thickness of the bronze scales. He asks a theological question. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? Modern readers often breeze past this phrase, assuming it is merely an ancient insult, the equivalent. It is a voice that demands a champion. It is a voice that promises slavery. We have all heard the story that follows, of a young man trash-talking an opponent before a fight. But to the ancient Hebrew ear, this is not an insult. It is a precise legal and theological diagnosis. To understand the weight of David's words, we must look back hundreds of years to the book of Genesis. God established a covenant with Abraham, and circumcision was the physical sign of that unbreakable agreement. It was the permanent mark of belonging to Yahweh. The terms of that ancient covenant were explicit. God promised to protect his people, declaring that he would bless those who blessed them and curse anyone who cursed them. When David calls Goliath uncircumcised, he is not mocking the giant's biology. He is identifying the giant's fatal vulnerability. He is stating a legal fact. Goliath stands completely outside the protection and promise of God. The Israelite army looked at the valley and saw a physical anomaly, a man of impossible size and strength. David looked at the exact same valley and saw a theological impossibility. How could a man who stands entirely outside the covenant openly defy the armies of the living God and survive? This is the hidden engine of David's confidence. He is not fueled by youthful arrogance or naive optimism. He is relying on a legal contract signed by God centuries before he was born. It has become the universal metaphor for an impossible challenge. The ultimate underdog narrative. A small, defenseless shepherd boy leaves his sheep and walks onto a blood-soaked battlefield. The soldiers saw an invincible fortress of bronze. David saw a dead man walking. He knew that Goliath's physical mass was completely irrelevant when weighed against the promises of Yahweh. This reveals the true tragedy of the Israelite camp. The men on the ridge were paralyzed, not just because Goliath was large, but because they had suffered widespread theological amnesia. When you forget your covenant identity, every obstacle looks insurmountable. If you measure the giants in your life against your own fragile strength, your own resources, or your own intellect, you will eventually collapse in fear. The math will never work in your favor. But David measured the giant against the character of God. But absolute theological confidence does not erase the physical reality of a battle. A covenant promise does not automatically deflect a 15-pound iron spearhead. David could not simply shout theology from the safety of the ridge. He still had to step onto the hot dirt. He still had to face the man. When his bold words reach the royal tent, David is summoned, and he volunteers to fight. But before he can walk down into the valley, King Saul decides to help him. And in doing so, the king attempts to give the shepherd the worst possible advantage. Inside the royal tent, the air is thick with desperation. King Saul stares at the young shepherd who has just volunteered to do what no veteran will do. He refuses the king's royal armor. He carries only a wooden staff, a leather sling, and 5 smooth stones taken from a nearby brook. Saul has no other options. But his political instinct remains intact. If this boy is going to step into the valley and fight on behalf of the nation, he must at least look like a soldier. Saul decides to dress David in his own personal armor. The decision is telling. Saul was famously described in Scripture as being a head taller than any man in Israel. His royal armor was massive, custom-built for a king, who was supposed to be a giant in his own right. When the heavy coat of mail is draped over David's shoulders, the metal swallows him. A bronze helmet is placed on his head. A royal sword is strapped to his waist. For a moment, the shepherd is encased in the pinnacle of human defense. The tent smells of sweat and polished leather. But when David tries to take a single step forward, he freezes. The text records his quiet realization: I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. The metal is too rigid. The weight is suffocating. But David is rejecting more than just poorly fitted bronze. He is rejecting a fundamentally flawed paradigm of warfare. Saul wants David to fight the giant. On the giant's terms, Goliath is the ultimate heavy infantryman. Saul's military logic dictates that the only way to counter heavy infantry is to send out your own heavy infantry. But in ancient combat, sending a smaller, heavily armored boy into hand-to-hand combat against a massive, by all conventional human logic, he is walking to an immediate, violent death. The giant waiting for him is a towering fortress of bronze and iron. Heavily armored champion is a mathematical guarantee of death. Saul is trying to squeeze David into the world's method of survival. If David fights in Saul's armor and somehow miraculously survives, the victory belongs to Saul's equipment, validating the king's worldly strategy. But God will not share his glory with Saul's bronze. This is the same pressure we face when standing in our own valleys. When a crisis towers over you, the immediate temptation is to put on Saul's armor. You are told to fight using the world's metrics: aggression, manipulation, frantic control, or visible displays of power. You are pressured to wear the expectations of others, fighting your battles exactly the way they fight theirs. But David recognizes the trap. He will not trade the covenant confidence he learned in the lonely pastures for the polished insecurity of a terrified king. He unbuckles the sword. He removes the heavy helmet. He lets the bronze coat of mail fall to the dirt floor of the tent. He refuses to wear another man's fear. When David finally walks out of the camp and steps down the rocky slope toward the valley floor, he appears completely defenseless. He is wearing only a simple, lightweight tunic. In one hand, he carries a wooden shepherd's staff. Tucked into his belt is a small pouch. In his other hand, he holds a simple woven leather sling. The boy is armed with what modern readers assume is a child's toy. The problem is not that this familiar interpretation is completely wrong. To the veteran soldiers watching from the safety of the ridge, he looks like a foolish boy walking blindly into a violent slaughter. But appearances in the valley are deeply deceiving. The men on the ridge have completely miscalculated the battle. The Israelite army groans as he leaves the tent. Goliath will soon laugh as he approaches. They both look at the small piece of leather dangling from the shepherd's hand and see a harmless distraction. We think of his weapon as a toy. Ancient generals knew better. When modern readers hear the word sling, we instinctively picture a child's toy. We imagine a small, Y-shaped wooden stick with an elastic band, used to chase away birds or break windows. Because the modern elastic slingshot was not invented until the mid-19th century, we accidentally project a harmless toy backward into the biblical text. We look at David and see a helpless boy armed with a piece of wood. But the weapon David held in his hand in the Valley of Elah was completely different. It was a pouch of woven wool or leather, attached to two long cords. And in the ancient Mediterranean world, it was one of the most lethal weapons of war ever devised. Ancient armies were generally organized into three specialized divisions. Cavalry rode horses or chariots. Heavy infantry wore armor and carried swords.